There are moments in history when something breaks quietly. No sirens. No emergency broadcasts. No official announcement saying, "This is the point of no return." And yet, everything changes. The United States has just crossed one of those moments. Not with a war. Not with a market crash. But with a number so large, so abstract, that most people's brains instinctively tune it out. $38 trillion. That is the current U.S. national debt. Not projected. Not hypothetical. Not, someday if nothing changes. Right now. And if that number doesn't immediately scare you, that's not because it isn't dangerous. It's because it's too big to feel real. That's how the real crises work. We've been trained to fear recessions, stock market crashes, housing bubbles. Events that happen fast, make noise, and dominate headlines. This one is different. This one grows in the background while the economy appears strong, while unemployment looks manageable, while markets tell us everything is fine. But underneath that surface, the math has already broken. The debt isn't just growing, it's accelerating. And more importantly, it has reached a point where paying it back is no longer part of the plan. Not through spending cuts. Not through higher taxes. Not through growth. Because those options no longer work at this scale. What replaces them is something far more subtle, far more technical, and far more destructive for anyone who saves, earns, or plans for the future. The debt won't be defaulted on. It will be erased. Not by repayment, but by inflation. And the people who will pay for it won't vote on it, won't see a bill for it, and won't even realize it's happening until their savings quietly buy less, their pensions stretch thinner, and their standard of living slips backward year after year. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not hidden in classified documents. It's not happening behind closed doors. It's happening in plain sight, inside central bank policy statements, budget projections, and technical adjustments most people never read. The system isn't collapsing. It's being re-engineered. And by the time most people understand what's going on, the transfer will already be complete. In this video, we're going to walk step by step through how the United States reached a debt level that can no longer be paid back, why traditional solutions are off the table, and how the government is preparing to make tens of trillions of dollars effectively disappear, without calling it a default. By the end, you'll understand why this moment matters, why the timeline is shorter than anyone wants to admit, and why the middle class will ultimately bear the cost of a decision it never agreed to. Because once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. And everything happening in global finance right now suddenly makes sense. To understand why this debt can't be paid back, you first have to understand scale. Not political scale. Not moral scale. Mathematical scale. For decades, government debt followed a familiar pattern. It rose during crises, stabilized during recoveries, and grew slowly enough that economic growth could at least pretend to keep up. That era is over. What we're dealing with now is not linear growth. It's exponential acceleration. The United States isn't adding debt in billions anymore. It's not even adding it in hundreds of billions. It's adding debt in trillions and doing so faster with each passing year. At this point, the government is borrowing money just to service existing obligations. New debt isn't funding new prosperity, it's funding yesterday's promises. This is the critical distinction most people miss. Debt becomes fatal not when it's large, but when it starts compounding faster than the system supporting it. And that's exactly what's happening now. Interest payments on the national debt have quietly become one of the largest expenses in the federal budget. Not defense. Not healthcare. Not infrastructure. Interest. Money spent on absolutely nothing tangible. No new roads. No new technology. No increase in productivity. Just payments to keep the system from collapsing under its own weight. At current levels, even small changes in interest rates translate into massive consequences. When rates rise by just 1 percentage point, the cost to service the debt increases by hundreds of billions of dollars per year. That's not a rounding error. That's an entire government program, gone. And here's the trap. To pay that interest, the government has to borrow more. But borrowing more increases perceived risk. Higher risk demands higher interest rates. Higher rates increase interest costs, which forces more borrowing. This isn't theory. This is a debt spiral. Once a government enters it at this scale, there are only 3 historical exits. 1. Default. 2. Austerity so extreme it collapses society. 3. Inflation. Default is politically and geopolitically impossible for the United States. It would shatter global finance overnight. Austerity on the required scale would mean cutting core programs, pensions, and benefits in ways no elected government could survive. That leaves inflation. Not runaway, overnight hyperinflation, at least not initially. but persistent, structural inflation that slowly erodes the real value of obligations over time. This is why talking about paying down the debt has quietly disappeared from serious policy discussions. The numbers are too big, the interest costs are too heavy, and the political system is too fragile. The debt is no longer something to be solved. It's something to be managed out of existence. And that's where the role of the central bank becomes unavoidable. Because when governments can no longer rely on markets to absorb their debt at sustainable rates, they turn to the only buyer that never runs out of money, the one institution that can create it. In the next section, we're going to look at how that process works, how debt monetization moved from an emergency tool to a permanent feature of the system, and why most people don't realize it's already happening. Because the moment the central bank becomes the buyer of last resort, the rules of the game fundamentally change. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. At first glance, raising interest rates sounds like responsible policy. Inflation rises, rates go up. Prices cool, stability returns. That's how it's supposed to work. But that logic breaks down when a country is carrying tens of trillions of dollars in debt. Because interest rates don't just affect inflation. They directly determine whether the debt itself is survivable. When rates were near zero, the system could pretend everything was under control. Borrowing was cheap. Refinancing old debt was painless. Interest payments stayed manageable, even as the total debt exploded. But once rates rise, reality catches up. Every new bond is issued at a higher cost. Every maturing bond has to be rolled over at worse terms. And the interest bill starts to grow faster than the economy itself. At this scale, the government is no longer fighting inflation alone. It's fighting arithmetic. This creates a paradox that few people talk about openly. The central bank raises rates to fight inflation. But those same rate hikes make the debt crisis dramatically worse. So policymakers are trapped between two unacceptable outcomes. Keep rates high and let interest costs spiral out of control. Or suppress rates and allow inflation to quietly erode purchasing power. Neither option is painless. But only one of them avoids an immediate collapse. This is why the idea of higher for longer interest rates is fundamentally incompatible with the current debt load. Markets sense this. Bond investors sense this. And increasingly so do central bankers. Which is why, beneath the public messaging about discipline and restraint, a different strategy is forming. A strategy designed not to eliminate the debt outright, but to neutralize it. And the key to that strategy is ensuring there is always a buyer for government debt, regardless of price, risk, or return. That buyer is not the market. It's the central bank. Once the central bank steps in as a consistent purchaser of government bonds, interest rates stop being a true market signal. They become a policy choice. And when interest rates are a policy choice, inflation becomes a policy tool. This is the point where monetary policy and fiscal policy quietly merge. The government borrows. The central bank buys. New money enters the system. And the debt remains paid, at least on paper. This is not hypothetical. It's not experimental. It's already been done before. During financial crises, during emergencies, during moments when the system was at risk of seizing up. But what was once temporary has a habit of becoming permanent. And that brings us to the mechanism that makes all of this possible. The one most people misunderstand, underestimate, or dismiss entirely. In the next part, we're going to break down debt monetization, how it works, why it's legally clean, and why it's the only option left once the interest rate trap closes. Because when a government starts paying its debts with newly created money, the consequences don't show up immediately. They show up slowly. Everywhere. When people hear the phrase printing money, they imagine something reckless. Banknotes flying off presses. Instant chaos. Overnight collapse. That's not how it works anymore. Modern debt monetization is quiet, technical, and almost invisible to the average person. Here's the mechanism. Instead of borrowing primarily from private investors, the government increasingly relies on its own central bank. The central bank creates new money electronically and uses it to purchase government bonds. No taxes are raised. No spending is cut. No vote is required. From the government's perspective, it's perfect. They get the money they need to operate. The bonds are sold. And the debt appears to be serviced. But in reality, the money used to buy those bonds didn't exist before the transaction. It was created. And that's the critical point. When new money enters the system without a corresponding increase in real goods and services, the value of existing money declines. Not instantly. Not evenly. But inevitably. On paper, the debt still exists. In practice, its real value begins to shrink. And here's the part that rarely gets explained clearly. When the central bank holds government debt, the interest payments flow back to the government itself. It's the state paying interest to an institution it ultimately controls. It looks like a functioning system. But no real wealth is being created. No real obligation is being reduced. The debt hasn't been solved. It's been diluted. This approach was used during past crises under names like emergency liquidity and quantitative easing. It was framed as temporary, exceptional, necessary to stabilize markets. But the scale matters. Once trillions of dollars are created this way, reversing the process becomes nearly impossible without triggering a financial shock. And so the emergency quietly becomes the baseline. The system adapts to permanent intervention. At that point, debt monetization stops being a tool of last resort and becomes the default operating system. This is why inflation isn't a policy failure. It's a feature. Because inflation is the mechanism through which the debt is actually reduced, not in nominal terms but in real terms. The government doesn't need to pay back the full purchasing power of what it borrowed. It only needs to pay back the number. And if that number is repaid in weaker dollars, the difference is absorbed by everyone holding the currency. This is how the burden shifts from the balance sheet of the state to the savings accounts of the public. But debt monetization alone isn't enough at this scale. Printing money without credibility eventually leads to loss of confidence. So the system needs something else. A way to make this process look responsible, orderly, even prudent. That's where asset revaluation enters the picture. And in the next section we're going to look at how gold, digital assets, and reserve accounting are being positioned to give political and financial cover to the largest silent wealth transfer in modern history. Because this isn't just about money creation. It's about redefining value itself. Inflation is often described as rising prices. That description is convenient and incomplete. Because inflation isn't just about what things cost. It's about what your money is worth. When the government monetizes debt, it doesn't send you a bill. It doesn't announce a new tax. It doesn't ask for consent. Instead, it changes the unit of measurement. The dollar stays the dollar in name but not in substance. And that's why inflation is the most effective tax ever created. It's automatic, it's continuous, and it's politically invisible. When prices rise, most people blame corporations, supply chains, or temporary shocks. Rarely do they trace the cause back to monetary expansion and debt policy. That confusion is not accidental. Because inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. Those closest to newly created money, governments, financial institutions, large asset holders, benefit first. They spend the new dollars before prices fully adjust. By the time that money reaches wages, pensions, and savings accounts, prices have already risen. The result is a quiet redistribution of wealth. From savers to borrowers. From workers to asset holders. From the public to the state. Your savings lose purchasing power. Your future earnings by less. Your retirement assumptions slowly break. But on government balance sheets, the debt looks more manageable. This is the core illusion. Nominal debt stays the same. Real debt shrinks. And because the process unfolds over years rather than days, it avoids panic. There's no single moment where people revolt. No obvious breaking point. Just gradual erosion. This is why inflation is so useful as a policy tool. It allows the government to reduce the real value of its obligations while maintaining the appearance of stability. No default. No crisis announcement. No emergency legislation. Just normal economic life, with slightly worse outcomes every year. But inflation alone is not enough. If confidence in the currency collapses too quickly, the system breaks. People rush into alternatives. Capital flees. Control is lost. So the strategy requires something else. A signal of strength. A way to anchor trust. A narrative that says, this is managed, this is deliberate, this is under control. That's where asset revaluation comes in. In the next part, we'll examine how strategic assets, gold and digital reserves, are being positioned to support this transition, and how simple accounting changes can create trillions in value without producing a single new resource. Because when debt can't be paid, it must be redefined. When a system is overloaded with debt, credibility becomes more important than cash. You can create money. You can suppress interest rates. But you cannot force confidence. That has to be managed. This is where asset revaluation plays its role. Governments don't need to acquire new assets to strengthen their balance sheets. They only need to change how existing assets are valued. This has been done before. Gold, for most of modern history, has been held on government balance sheets at prices that had little to do with market reality. By adjusting those prices, states could instantly create balance sheet strength without producing anything new. The same logic is now quietly expanding beyond gold. Digital assets, strategic reserves, and alternative stores of value are being discussed not as speculative instruments, but as components of national financial architecture. Not to solve the debt outright, but to make the transition appear orderly. When reserve assets are revalued upward, governments can claim increased net worth. That perceived strength provides political cover for continued monetary expansion. On paper, the books look healthier. In reality, the currency continues to weaken. At the same time, the rest of the world is paying attention. Foreign governments hold massive amounts of U.S. debt. When that debt is repaid in devalued dollars, the loss doesn't show up as a default, but the purchasing power is gone. This is why we're seeing a gradual but accelerating shift away from dollar dependence. Trade in local currencies. Alternative payment systems. Rising central bank gold purchases. This isn't ideology. It's risk management. As confidence in the long-term value of the dollar erodes, countries seek assets that can't be diluted by policy decisions made elsewhere. And there's a second force amplifying this shift: the global energy transition. For decades, global demand for dollars was supported by energy trade. As that system weakens and alternatives emerge, fewer dollars are required for international settlement. That changes everything. When global demand for dollars falls, excess dollars don't disappear. They come home. And when they do, they expand the domestic money supply even further, amplifying inflation at precisely the moment the system is least able to absorb it. This is why the timeline matters. The window in which the United States can monetize debt without triggering a full loss of confidence is shrinking. Which brings us to the final stage. The point where the strategy becomes unavoidable, and where the cost becomes impossible to ignore. In the final part, we're going to tie all of this together: the debt, the inflation, the revaluation, and the global shift, and explain what it means for the people who had no say in any of it. Because once the repricing begins in earnest, there's no pause button. At this stage, the outcome is no longer theoretical. All the pieces are already in motion. The debt is too large to repay. Interest costs are too heavy to sustain. Markets can no longer absorb unlimited issuance at honest prices. So the system adjusts. Not through collapse, but through repricing. This is the phase where nothing officially breaks, yet everything quietly changes. Your currency still works. Your bank still opens. Your paycheck still arrives. But each unit of money buys a little less than it did before. That is how the debt disappears. Not from the balance sheet, but from reality. The government fulfills its obligations in nominal terms, while the real value of those obligations is transferred elsewhere. The loss doesn't appear as a line item. It shows up in daily life. Housing becomes less attainable. Savings fall behind. Long-term plans quietly fail. The middle class absorbs the difference. Not because of a single decision, but because of a system designed to spread the cost thinly enough that no one moment feels unbearable. This is why this process is so effective. There is no vote. No announcement. No clear villain. Just policy adjustments described as technical necessities. By the time most people realize what's happening, the repricing is already complete. History shows that governments rarely choose default when inflation is an option. Inflation preserves the appearance of stability, even as it rewrites the social contract. And that is what's happening now. A financial reset, not declared, not debated, but implemented through mechanisms few people ever study. The question is no longer if this happens. It's whether you recognize it while it's unfolding. Because awareness doesn't stop the process, but it changes how you experience it. It allows you to see patterns instead of headlines, systems instead of events, signals instead of noise. And that's the purpose of this channel. If you want to understand how global finance really works beneath the surface, not the simplified version, not the comforting version, but the one that actually drives outcomes, then this is where you belong. This is Finance Archives. Here we don't chase trends. We document mechanisms. We study the forces shaping the next decade before they become obvious. If this breakdown helped you see the system more clearly, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. More deep dives like this are coming, and the timeline is moving faster than most people realize. The Great Repricing has already begun. The only question left is whether you'll be watching it blindly or with understanding.